And we are back on the Zero Hour. Joining us now is Zaid Jilani, who is a writer and activist. He has written for Salon, The Huffington Post, The Nation, Think Progress. He has been an activist with the Progressive Change Campaign Committee. Following the wiretap scandal in 2013, he presented a petition with over 100,000 signatures against government spying on its own citizens. Zaid, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Well, and great to have you, although circumstances not so great. We've been talking a little bit on this show about Gaza and about the surprising, even to me, I think, and I'm pretty jaded, slant that I seem to see in coverage of the Gaza crisis and the attack on Gaza in the United States media. And I know you've had some thoughts about that. Am I off base to think that we're basically only getting one side of the story here?
Well, I think the important thing is that people understand that if you look at the broader picture, we typically don't get the full story here. I mean, you can recall when Kerry made his remarks a few months ago to a private group, and it was recorded, saying that Israel could be heading towards apartheid if it doesn't settle with the Palestinians. You'll see even during that time, the majority of guests on to talk about Kerry's comments were either Israelis or supporters of the Israeli government. And I think that this imbalance has been around for such a long time that we almost sort of don't notice it. And I think we've noticed it a lot during this conflict, but I think it's even more deadly that it's something that sort of persists even when there isn't sort of live fire going on. Even when, we have, for example, political conventions, we have politicians constantly talking about Israel, very rarely talking about the Palestinians. When we have debates between political candidates, we have resolutions before Congress. Congress in both houses just unanimously passed a resolution backing the Israeli side of the conflict rather than taking an even-handed approach or an approach that at least recognizes that Palestinians have legitimate grievances here. So I think, this is sort of a symptom of a wider problem. That being said, I think we have seen some good pockets here and there. I mean, Chris Hayes has brought on several good Palestinian guests, including people speaking straight from the West Bank and from the reporter Ayman Mohideen in Gaza. And I think a couple of the other hosts also have done a little bit more than I would expect. Jake Tapper had some very good aggressive interviews with Israeli spokesmen. And I think that, there's some people in the media, particularly people who are in Gaza. The media was actually able to be situated within Gaza this time, which it wasn't able to in 2008 during Operation Cast Lead. So I think the door is starting to creak open a little bit. But yeah, I definitely share that critique overall.
Well, I think, and you've raised a number of great points there, and I'd like to just kind of try to go over them. One is the political class for our elected officials who I think have basically made the calculus that it's just too dangerous for them to critique an Israeli policy. And so we see resolutions like the one we saw pass through Congress, but the other piece of the equation is the media. And we've seen, it's interesting because you mentioned something that I think is very important to bring up, which is after years of what I would characterize as one-sided coverage of this issue, we're seeing the kind of shift now where, for example, I believe it was NBC who had a reporter doing excellent coverage in Gaza, who covered some children being killed on a beach and so on, and was pulled and then on what seemed to be fictitious circumstances because it was too dangerous, but then they put Richard Engel in there, who's much better known, and he was brought back. So there was a lot of social media pressure and public pressure around that. They seem to respond. You mentioned Jake Tapper and others asking tough questions. Some people are saying that things may be shifting in the coverage of the Israeli-Palestinian situation, and that may be in part, especially on the media side rather than the political side, and that may be in part because social media are giving people the other side of the story, and that's leading to pressure from social media and elsewhere to get broader reporting. Do you think there's anything to that?
Yeah, I think during this major flare-up and the last two major flare-ups, that's definitely been true with social media. And I think there's also a reflection of that in the polling. So Gallup did some polling on this issue, and they found that I think it was 51% of people under age of 30 think Israel's actions are unjustified. And I believe a plurality of people under, I think it was 35, maybe agree, have the same view. I think the massive that's a massive age split, as every other age group pretty much is in support of the offensive. And I think something only like 25% are even supportive in that age group. So I think a big part of that is the split between how people are consuming their news. On social media, you're primarily, I think, seeing mostly, in the Jewish Daily Forward wrote an article about this, you're primarily seeing pictures, video, on-the-ground stuff, whereas in the newspapers, on television, you see a lot of editorializing, a lot of Israeli spokesmen or members of Congress who are sympathetic to Israel, or activists who are sympathetic to Israel. So I think just seeing the raw information has changed a lot of the debate. And I think the polling on how young people are against this is part of that. And to me, it's really interesting that pretty much, particularly with the Democratic Party, every one of their constituency groups is polled to be against the offensive. That includes women, minorities, and young people. And yet we still have not seen that filter up to the politicians. I was very disappointed to see Jason Carter, who lives in my state, attend a Stand With Israel rally. And I had some choice words with some of his senior staff about that behind the scenes, considering, his grandfather had been very out front on this issue. But I think that it's just the fact that politicians do really feel like this is an opportunity just to show their pro-Israel bona fides. There's plenty of people in the media who are sympathetic to that. There's a lot of donors who are sympathetic to that. In some parts of the country, you'd get votes for doing that, although honestly, the vote thing is a little bit overplayed. There's most parts of the country, people do not vote on foreign policy at all, let alone Israel. But I think politicians just tend to not be leaders. They tend to be behind the trend and behind curves. And so I think it'll take a lot more of this to flip the situation again. A lot of people probably my age don't realize that in the 1980s and even in the early 1990s, you even had politicians like Mitch McConnell signing letters saying, Israel should be ceding some territory. It's not right to be doing land grabs, things like that, because our politics wasn't always so stridently pro-Israel as it is today. And I do think that it can flip once again. And I think that's why you're seeing Israeli spokespeople going on every single TV network, frantically arguing with people like Jake Tapper, because they are afraid that we may take a more even-handed approach in the future, and that the political consensus that we have right now may just not hold.
And now, when you mentioned Jason Carter, we should let people know that his grandfather is Jimmy Carter, and that former president of the United States, of course, and who has been very outspoken, written a book on this issue, compared the Palestinian situation to a form of apartheid. He is. There was a massive attempt, as there have been with other critics on this issue, to discredit Carter, to marginalize Jimmy Carter, to marginalize him from the conversation. But it's interesting what you say about a potential shift here, and some of us do remember when, for example, it was not only acceptable to talk about moderating some of Israel's more aggressive policies, but I think even very dedicated Israeli supporters were committed to that with the understanding or the belief that doing so was in Israel's best interest as well, because it would help stabilize the region, it would help shore up international support, and so on. And I think what we've seen, in a way, it seems to me, I'm curious to know if you agree, it seems almost like an analog to gun laws, where we've seen the most hardcore adherents, a subset of the population, drive the debate, with the result that they may wind up marginalizing even a broader position than they want. But do we have a situation here where we really have a small but very vocal subset driving this debate and polarizing it?
I think that's a very good analogy. The NRA today is not like the NRA of 20 or 30 years ago even. The NRA of actually 60 or 70 years ago was actively supporting gun control laws, thinking that some of them were reasonable, and that it'd be in the best interest of gun owners to support some gun laws, because they can't oppose everything. And I think that the main Israel lobby, which is AIPAC, has become the same way. There's progressive figures out there today like M.J. Rosenberg, David Sirota, who actually at one point worked for AIPAC. Today they don't want anything to do with the organization because the organization has gone so far to the right. You probably are some analogs with the Christian right. The Christian right today is actually probably in terms of sheer numbers, is larger than AIPAC. I think I looked at their Facebook likes. They have something like 1.3 million Facebook likes is the group Christians United for Israel, whereas AIPAC only has like 66,000. So I think the Christian right itself has become smaller in number. There's a lot less people who identify as Christian right than have ever identified that way in recent history, and yet I think they've become more fervent and more intent on sort of tacking further and further to the right on this issue. Senator Ted Cruz is an example of that. Ted Cruz postulated, without any evidence whatsoever, that the FAA banned flights to Tel Aviv because Obama was trying to punish Israel. Now, the FAA is supposed to be above political influence, and if that was true, it would be a massive scandal. But the interesting thing was that Cruz and the Israelis themselves were calling on the FAA to lift that ban, which is also politicizing the FAA, right? So I think,
could have led to could have led to tragedy, of course, because they were reportedly banning those flights because of fear of missile attacks and so on. So unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. But I do have to say, Zaid Jilani, I think the analogy with the Christian right is also very apt, and I think you find younger generations of Christians are less likely to support the Christian right. We may find that younger generations of Jewish Americans, it seems to appear, are less likely to support the AIPAC position. So we'll keep tracking this story. I hope you'll come back and talk to us again about it. And thanks so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you.
We will be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.